So, it's been a year since Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the movie that officially introduced Shadow into the movieverse. However, it also introduced Maria, the girl who was the motivating factor behind him teaming up with a Robotnik to try and destroy the planet. However, these two versions of the character, despite serving a similar narrative purpose, have some radical differences from one another. From something as minor as changing the era she lived in to removing the plot point about her illness, let's go over all the changes made to Maria's character for the movie and figure out which one is the superior character. Not much is known about either Maria's backstory, but let's go over what we do know. For gay Maria, we know that she was born on and spent some of her childhood on Earth. This is due to her having been old enough to remember a trip to Spagonia. Once she contracted Nids, which we'll talk about later, Gerald took her to the Ark, both to keep her safe from pathogens on Earth she could more easily contract, and because the low gravity kept her disease in remission. Movie Maria? Well, we know even less about her backstory. All we know is that she traveled with Gerald to Shadow Base so he could help them poke the furry that fell from the sky. By the way, did you know that this place is apparently called Shadow Base? However, still, it does seem odd that a child would be allowed in a high security black site experimenting with a dangerous creature. So, just for fun, I would like to propose my own headcanon for movie Maria's backstory. She was an orphan placed under Gerald's care due to him being her closest living relative. She would have been used to traveling around with him and spending most of her childhood in and around the labs where he worked. I say this because she seems rather unfazed by the variety of high tech medical equipment and shows no fear directly disobeying the older scientists, implying she's used to environments like this. She doesn't even seem that scared of Shadow, but obviously, this is just a headcanon. For backstory, I think I'll have to give it to Dame Maria, as she actually has one, and it provides a reason as to why she's even on the Ark in the first place. However, as we all know, someone else was on the Ark with her. Maria's relationship with Shadow is pretty consistent across both mediums, a girl and her 3 foot tall hedgehog. However, there are a few differences that, in my opinion, drastically separate the two. I think it's important to go over the nature of Shadow's origins in both stories, as they vary wildly and, in my opinion, heavily change the context behind their bond. In the games, Shadow was a bioengineered hedgehog created by Gerald Robotnik to be the ultimate life form. Gerald intended for him to bring prosperity and happiness to the world, but Gunn wanted him to create a living weapon for their own purposes. Gerald died, which led to the creation of Shadow. Shadow was also made using the DNA of an alien overlord who wanted to use him to conquer the Earth, but that doesn't really tie into how his relationship with Maria progresses, and Shadow in the movies has yet to be confirmed to have any connections to the Black Arms. Speaking of, Shadow has a radically different origin story in the movies, not being a creation of Gerald or a weapon commissioned by the government, but instead an alien anomaly falling to Earth in a black comet. To be honest, I'm perfectly fine with this change, and it especially fits better given the Mobians are aliens thing the movies have established. However, I would also argue that making him a creature of unknown origin makes his relationship with Maria much more organic. In the games, Shadow was created partially because of Maria. He was intended to be the cure to her debilitating illness, among other things, and his existence is irrevocably linked to her and her disease. The two were more or less forced to develop a bond. If Maria didn't exist, or even if she wasn't sick, Shadow would have had no reason to be created. However, in the movies, Maria chose to form a bond with Shadow. She could have easily avoided or ignored him, or treated him like a dangerous anomaly just like the scientists, but she instead saw him for what he was, a kid like her, and went out of her way to befriend him. Shadow's altered origin and the shifted nature of their relationship makes their bond deeper. Shadow has no idea where he comes from. All he knows is that he isn't from Earth and he's the only talking hedgehog on the planet. He's stuck in a lab full of humans who care less about him and is forced to be a lab rat so they could research and exploit him. He's burdened with powers that not even he knows the full extent of and is made out to be a monster for it. Maria, however, reminds him that it doesn't matter where he comes from or what he could do. Earth is his home, she is his friend, and his abilities are what he wants to make of them. Rather than their relationship being marked by Shadow existing solely for Maria's sake, their relationship is marked by Maria seeing a lonely, scared kid where everyone else saw a dangerous alien freak. For their relationship with Shadow, I'll have to give it to Movie Maria, as their relationship comes about much more naturally than it does in the games and has a lot more emotional weight behind it. However, we all know how their friendship comes to an end. Good things can't last forever, and this is proven when Maria is taken out by a gun soldier during a raid. Yet there are some differences in how her death is portrayed in the movies versus the games. In the games, Gunn raided the Ark due to fear of Shadow's power and wanting to cover up the existence of the project, purging anyone with knowledge of his creation, which unfortunately meant Maria. She and Shadow attempted to escape, but Maria was shot by a gun soldier, and only Shadow was able to make it to an escape pod, and Maria had to use the last of her strength to eject him to Earth before she died. In the movies, pretty much the same thing happens, but with one major difference. Maria wasn't directly shot by a gun soldier, but instead a gun soldier sought a canister of chaos energy harvested from Shadow, and she was killed in the ensuing explosion. The soldier did intend to shoot her, but Walters, Paramount's equivalent of Commander Towers essentially, grabbed him and caused him to misfire, hitting the canister instead. Movie Maria and Game Maria's deaths are functionally the same, with the only real difference being the specifics of what killed them. Some people accuse the change to her death to be pro military censorship, but personally, I don't see it that way. The soldier says they had orders and clearly still intended to shoot Maria. The only reason he missed was because of Walter's independent action. It's made explicitly clear that Gunn are the bad guys here, and Walter still feels guilty about his inability to save her and decision to put Shadow in stasis even 50 years later. While the specifics of what killed her are slightly different, you still keep the important core element of Gunn wrongfully executed a young girl because they decided she was guilty by association. Comparing the events leading up to her death is like comparing Gala apples to Fuji ones. The differences are imperceptible, and at the end of the day, you still have your sweet red apple or dead 12-year-old. I think Game Maria and Movie Maria are tied for this one, as both versions of their murder, while different, still keep the parts that matter. However, this wasn't the only controversial change Paramount made to Maria's character. You may know that in the games, Maria suffered from a disease called Nids, or neuroimmune deficiency syndrome, which is implied to be a neurological disorder that affects one's immune system similar to HIV or AIDS. This disease would have been fatal, and like explained earlier, it was the reason behind her being brought to the Ark. However, in the movie, Nids is never once mentioned. It's not even implied Maria has any sort of disease, fatal or otherwise. To some, this change didn't matter. Dead girl is still dead after all. But to some, looked like the removal of a disabled character. However, I think framing it like this is giving Gay Maria a bit too much credit. Maria isn't described as having any sort of disease in Sonic Adventure 2, it only being mentioned in the game's manual. Gay Maria is hardly a shining example of excellent disability representation, with the inclusion of it seeming more like an afterthought to give an explanation as to why Gerald agreed to create Shadow in the first place. We do get more expansion on her disease in Shadow Generations, which is a game that came out over 20 years later. You aren't losing much by getting rid of Maria's illness, and it even makes more sense given the changes made to Shadow's origin. In the movies, Shadow wasn't created with the intention of curing Maria's illness. He was just an alien who happened to crash land on Earth. He had no connection to Maria prior to their meeting in the labs, so giving her a fatal disease would have had no impact on their relationship. It would have made her illness feel even more like trauma porn than it does in the games, and like I said earlier, I think not including it makes their bond even more meaningful. I think both game and movie Maria are equally good and valid versions of the character. They serve their purposes for both versions of the story while still keeping what's necessary to make them Maria Robotnik. So we've reached the end of the video. Which version of Maria's character do I think is superior? Game or movie?
Both? Both. Both. Both is good.
Consider, Game Shadow was bioengineered to be the ultimate life form, the key to immortality, the Omnicure, and the messiah of the Black Arms. He had all these purposes and expectations placed on him. He was hardly allowed to be his own person. Game Shadow needed a Maria who could remind him that he was who he wanted to be, not who he was made to be. On the other hand, Movie Shadow was an alien with no memory of his past, who fell to Earth and was treated like a test subject in a lab by people who could care less about him. He was lost, alone, and had to deal with being dehumanized and exploited by the scientists who found him. Movie Shadow needed a Maria who showed him that he could be happy and live for himself, not to be a research subject, a power source, or a tool. Both versions of her character are equally tragic and their stories equally impactful. Gay Maria's story was a tragedy because between Nids and Gunn, her fate was more or less inevitable. Movie Maria's story was a tragedy because the circumstances behind her death should have never been created in the first place. Anyway, that's all from me. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all next time.